Today's episode marks the launch of Heavy Hands on Patreon.
If you don't know what Patreon is, it's basically ongoing crowdfunding. Essentially, it's a platform that will allow you, our listeners, to patronize our show in exchange for rewards.
Currently, we have rewards set for monthly pledges of $1, $3, and $5.
You can get your name read on the show or posted on the Heavy Hands website, and you can even get a guaranteed spot in the Heavy Bag, our listener mail segment.
If you'd like to donate more than that per month, we're open to discussing other rewards, including custom scouting work and fight analysis.
We've enjoyed bringing you all the finer points of face punching for the last year, and we look forward to doing so for a long time yet.
Please help us cover our production costs and keep the show running smoothly each and every week. Check out Heavy Hands on Patreon.com. I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined, as always, by my illustrious co-host, Patrick Wyman. Pat, how are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm looking forward to talking about some fights.
Yeah, even though we had a bit of a troubled weekend of fights, wouldn't you say?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, I think the Dublin card, I mean, it just straight up fell apart. But there was still, you know, for what it ended up being in terms of the overall quality of the fighters, it still ended up being an entertaining card.
Absolutely. It was always going to be one of those cards, right, where, it was made up. The undercard was pretty much what you would want to see from a fight night kind of card. A lot of crossroads kind of fights, lots of fun prospects, a lot of interesting tests for prospects, some fighters who seem to have kind of lost their way, who were looking to get back on track. You had a lot of fights with enough meaning. It just didn't have any of the names that make you really care about a card. There was nothing to look forward to all evening. As good as Louis Smolka versus Paddy Holohan was, and it ended up being a really entertaining fight, it was not the kind of fight where you just spent all evening saying, boy, I can't wait to see that one.
Well, there was no narrative there, right?
Yeah.
There was no narrative behind any of those fights.
Yeah.
And what I mean by quality of fighters isn't like that they're bad fighters. It's that there isn't a ton of name value associated with them. And so you've got to be pretty deep into the MMA bubble to be fired up about a Stevie Ray Mikhail Labout matchup.
Yeah,
you got to be pretty deep in there. If indeed there are people outside of Glasgow who were real hype about that one.
Yeah, and the same could be said for the Bellator card that happened over the weekend. Bellator 144 also ended up being a pretty entertaining card, at least from what I saw, but it lost what was set to be a really interesting main event between Marcos Galvão and Eduardo Dantas, former training partners. It will be a rematch for the title that Dantas lost to Joe Warren.
Joe Warren, and then Galvão won it from Warren.
Yeah, so it would have been a really interesting fight. Dudu Dantas is always worth watching. Marcos Galvão, the same. And that fell apart. And so we ended up with a main event between Brandon Halsey and Rafael Carvalho, which was a fine fight, but everything just was kind of tainted a little bit. But the action of the fights, I guess we're really giving people an impression of the conflicted nature of the weekend, right? We're really trying to say good things about it.
I'll put it this way. I watched that entire Bellator card, and I had completely forgotten by the time we were recording today that I watched that Bellator card. I had no memory of it. I had no memory that I sat there and watched the entire thing.
Which the least you can say, and this has been the case for Bellator cards in the past, it didn't stick out in your memory as an egregiously bad card.
No, that's true. That's true. Watch it. And now that we're talking about it, I do recall Michael Page damn near killing a man. There was that. That was the thing.
It was basically a Little Caesars pizza kind of deal. Just eminently adequate. You paid $5, you can't complain. They have those nice little spice packets in the box, but boy, is it not gourmet pizza.
Yeah, yeah. There's no mistaking that it's not gourmet pizza, but not all pizza has to be gourmet for you to enjoy eating it.
That's true. That's true. And there was one thing that stood out to both of us from this weekend, which is the number of Southpaw versus Orthodox fights. Particularly, there were a few on the Bellator card as well, but particularly on the UFC Dublin card. And I think at last count we had 5 or 6 open stance matchups, meaning a fight in which the fighter's lead feet are directly opposing to their left foot versus right foot, Orthodox versus Southpaw. There were a lot of those matchups. It really kind of stands out to me, having, being someone who watches a lot of boxing too. You very rarely see a card with that many Southpaws on it in the squared circle.
Yeah, it was interesting for that reason, and they played out in interesting ways. And since it's been a long time since we discussed Southpaw fighting, I think it's been all the way. I think it was April the last time that we discussed this in the context of Luke Rockhold versus Lyoto Machida, which was a Southpaw matchup. It's been a long time since we talked about it, and we've got some thoughts because not only were there a lot of Southpaw Orthodox matchups on the UFC Dublin card, there was also what turned into, after a round or so, a Southpaw Orthodox matchup between Terence Bud Crawford and Darren John on HBO.
All of Terence Crawford's fights these days start to turn into Southpaw versus Orthodox matchups after a little while, it seems.
And since Terence Crawford is the man most likely to be challenging Manny Pacquiao in Pacquiao's retirement fight, that fight took on a little extra importance, and so I think we're going to go into some depth about that one as well. But all united under the common thread of Southpaw Orthodox matchups.
Yeah, and most notably jabbing Southpaws, whether it's a Southpaw using his right jab or an Orthodox fighter using his left jab, because that was one of those things that really seemed to the jab seemed really evident, not only in the Terence Crawford fight, and I know that a lot of our listeners are not boxing fans so much as they are MMA fans. I know that because our numbers are never as good as for boxing shows as they are for MMA shows. But we pretty much only talk about boxers that are really worth your time checking out on this show. It's not like we don't talk about the Louis Smolkas and Patty Holahans of the boxing world, as it were. We're not going to talk about a Friday night fight kind of main event. So if you haven't seen Terence Crawford fight, both of us highly encourage you to do so because he is very likely the next big thing, as you may have been hinted when Pat mentioned that he'll probably be fighting Manny Pacquiao in what is purportedly Manny's retirement fight in April. So definitely a fighter worth checking out. And as a southpaw, because he is a stance switcher, he's a switch hitter, as a southpaw he has an excellent jab. It's really his go-to weapon as a southpaw is his right hand.
Yeah, just a gorgeous jab. And so Connor, for you, having watched all of those Southpaw Orthodox matchups on the UFC Dublin card, who do you think did a particularly good job of utilizing their lead hand? Who stood out to you?
Let's see if I can recall who even fought. I'm thinking back. Oh my gosh, man. Nicholas Dalby Darren Till was an interesting one. Dalby used his jab quite well in the third round of that fight. Did a really nice job of swarming Till and closing the gap using his left hand. Whereas Till is heavily a left hand reliant southpaw and a left kick reliant southpaw. He's a very Muay Thai in that way, in that he relies on that rear leg and rear hand. Tom Breese had some okay jabs against Pender, but also again with the left hands. Let's see, who else do we have?
Stevie Ray did a good job of using his lead hand, but not so much as a jab, more as a right hook. Rob Whiteford against Darren Elkins, when he wasn't busy being smashed up against the fence, also did a good job with his right hook. But I think in general, you talked about the southpaw jab or the orthodox jab versus southpaws. I think in general in MMA we don't see a lot of effective lead hand work.
Even in boxing. I think in general in combat sports we don't see a lot of great southpaw versus orthodox tactical fighting. I think I've said this many times, although again I don't know that we've ever really have we dedicated an episode to southpaw tactics other than that Machida Romero episode?
It was the Machida Rockhold.
Machida Rockhold, sorry. I don't know that we have, where we've really got to talk about open stance fighting at length and in detail.
We talked. That was the only time that we did. But I don't think we talked. We talked about open stance jabbing about Artur Beterbiev, if memory serves correctly.
I love Artur Beterbiev, as I stumble over his name.
God.
Well, that wasn't me correcting you. That was me struggling through the name. And it's an interesting point that you make, because in my opinion, and keep in mind, I'm just an analyst. I've sparred southpaws, of course, but I've never fought a southpaw. But to me, it seems like a lot of the sort of voodoo that surrounds the idea of fighting a southpaw is more mental than physical. Mm-hmm. Where there's kind of this idea built up in the right-handed fighter's head that he needs a lot of really special preparation. And you know what's a really great point to underline this is that Darren, the man who fought Terence Crawford, he came into that fight and he had told the HBO commentary team before the bout, I sparred extensively with southpaws before this fight, but how hopeless did he look the moment that Terence Crawford went Southie?
Well, he looked helpless. He looked like he had no idea what he was doing there.
Right.
So I would add a caveat to what you just said, Connor, in the sense that I think you do need special preparation to fight a southpaw. I don't think that necessarily means that you need to change things like your shot selection.
Yes.
Or like so yeah, you need to, if you're going to fight southpaws, you need to spar with southpaws. You need to work on specific things to do, but you don't need to change your game. Like, yeah. And why do you, like, the reason you need to do all that is because the range is different and the angles are different.
I think one of the things, the classic advantage for a southpaw against an orthodox fighter is that southpaws spend their entire fighting careers fighting orthodox fighters, right? It's just a numbers game where if 15% of the fighting population is southpaw, is left-handed and stands right-hand lead, then they are going to, and the other 85% is right-handed, standing orthodox, then obviously one's going to have a lot more practice against the other than vice versa. And so the problem when you try to adopt special tactics for a southpaw is that you are letting them do what they always do and trying to do something particularly different yourself. I think there's this sort of pervasive notion that because you're fighting a different kind of fighter, you have to change the way you fight. And it's very rare that a fighter successfully makes a fundamental change to their style. So in the case of Darren, right, when Terence Crawford went southpaw, his volume disappeared. It completely went away because what had he been telling himself and what had he been training to do while he was fighting southpaws in the gym? Probably throw lead right hands, probably move in one direction to get his foot outside the opponent's foot, and probably looking to avoid straight left hands. And yet Terence Crawford fought very much like the way he does in orthodox as a southpaw. He relied heavily on his jab, he used his right hook, he threw combinations, he attacked the body. He didn't change anything. You know, Terence Crawford doesn't turn into a southpaw fighter when he fights southpaw. He's just Terence Crawford standing the other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an important point to get at, and that comes through really clearly if we think about some of the really good southpaw orthodox matchups that we've had in both MMA and boxing recently. I think about Lawler-McDonald as my quintessential one, where like Rory McDonald, who has a great jab, didn't suddenly stop jabbing Robbie Lawler because Robbie Lawler is a southpaw. Robbie Lawler, coming off of a whole bunch of fights against southpaws and Johnny Hendricks, like 2 fights against southpaws and Johnny Hendricks, didn't stop throwing his right hook or stop throwing his jab simply because he was fighting an orthodox fight. He didn't rely overly on his straight left. But now both Lawler and McDonald probably threw lead rear hands more often than they normally would against the same stance fighter. But they didn't stop doing that other stuff. It didn't change their approach. It didn't change their placement. It didn't change any of the underlying facets of their game. It didn't change their volume either. Both guys operated at basically their normal pace.
Yeah. So let's maybe try and get at this issue, and we can discuss some of these specific fights as we go. I want to talk about Till Dalby in particular because we both predicted that fight would be excellent, and it was. It was probably the best fight of the weekend, in my opinion. It was really entertaining, really tactical. And a well-deserved draw from Nicholas Dalby. But let's try and understand why it's a bad idea for an orthodox fighter to fundamentally change their approach. The first thing that the orthodox fighter is told to do, there are 2 things in conjunction that they're always told to do, right? The first is to rely on the lead right. The right hand becomes your jab, and the jab becomes ineffective. Why is that wrong?
Why is that? Well, first of all, most orthodox fighters are not used to throwing naked right hands, to throwing right hand leads. I mean, we've talked about this in the past with regard to Bernard Hopkins and Bernard Hopkins giving this advice to Rashad Evans. But like, you just throw a lead right. You don't think about it, just throw it. But that's really hard for a lot of guys to do because think about how often whether it's in your shadow boxing or whether it's in your pad work or you're working a bag, it's always 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2.
Well, you're taught from day one to work off of your jab. And we're going to be talking about the importance of working off your jab throughout today's episode.
Yeah, but suddenly, because the angle is different, and because you've got this in your head, it becomes harder and harder to pull the trigger on that shot, to just throw the shot, because the distance is different too. Like that, like I don't think that we should understate the importance of that. Like you don't want to change yourself too much, but like the angle really is different. The distance really is different, and it takes a little bit of getting used to.
That's exactly the point I was going to bring up, is how different the distance between Southpaw and Orthodox fighters are. Well, facing another Orthodox opponent, or if you're Southpaw facing another Southpaw, it's very, very easy to stand nice and close to someone. This is, for example, why Gennady Golovkin, when he's facing a Southpaw, will often step to Southpaw himself once he gets to the inside, because he wants to sandwich his right foot right in between the feet of the opponent so he can get his head against their head, work for head position, he can put a little shoulder pressure on, he can have body contact, where it's much more difficult to have that when you are in what is rightfully called open stance. There's a lot of open space. And so to cover that space with your right hand, you've got to be experienced to disguise that, against an opponent who expects it and is looking to counter you and hurt you for doing things that are predictable. Because if we think of boxing or fighting in general as a game of distance, then you are essentially attacking the furthest possible target, your opponent's head, with your furthest possible weapon, your rear hand, in a situation that places those two elements farther apart than they would be otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, how often when you're working pads do you have your opponents, like if you're just doing a pad session, how often do you have your pad holder stand in opposite stance?
Right.
Almost never. It's an entirely unfamiliar distance to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that gives an inherent advantage, I think, to the Southpaw in that situation, because the Southpaw is told from day one, you can just throw your left hand. You can just throw it straight down the pipe.
Yeah.
And so that came through very clearly in the Dalby Till fight with Till early. Like Till just throws his left hand. There's no setup. There's no telegraphing. He's not doing anything. He's not setting it up. He just throws it, and he's comfortable throwing it. And that was true of Tom Breese against Cathal Pendred too. Mm-hmm. He just threw the left hand, and he was comfortable throwing it.
And same for the left kick from both men too, because these same rules apply in a kickboxing match or in a kick fighting, MMA, however you call it. You just have to be comfortable letting it go. And I think, that the Tom Breese Cathal Pendred fight was a perfect example, because Cathal Pendred tried his fair share of lead rights too. And they were horribly awkward. He looked very uncomfortable doing it. Not that Cathal Pendred has ever looked particularly comfortable striking at range, but he looked more uncomfortable than usual. He did not know how to cover the distance without putting himself at risk. And that caused him to hesitate, which, ironically, is what put him at risk. It allowed there was a left uppercut, I believe, with which Breese countered him very early in the fight. I think like the second time that Pendred tried to lunge in with a lead right. Breese is a southpaw. That's the other thing. Southpaws are used to people using these same tactics against them. Not only are they used to fighting people who give them that orthodox look, but they're used to people who have it drilled into their head over and over again that they need to throw the lead right instead of the jab. So they're used to people who they know almost what to expect before they step into the ring. So they have another advantage, the advantage of preparation, of mental fortitude because of that, as well as the vast experience fighting fighters who look like this and stand like this and move like this. And I think this line of thought really places Orthodox fighters in a nerve-wracking situation where the first moment that southpaw makes you feel uncomfortable, you're like, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm doing what I was told, so how am I supposed to solve this riddle? It just becomes a really difficult situation, and I think that's why we see so many successful, slick southpaws in boxing, like Cuban boxers in particular. Guys like Rancis Barthelemy, who switches stances, guys like Erislandy Lara, like Guillermo Rigondeaux. These guys are so successful at being slick because it's like they just know everything their opponent's going to do. They have the advantage of that distance so they can see it coming. They have the advantage of foresight so they know what most of these underprepared orthodox opponents are going to try to do to them. It's like you can't rattle them. You can't rattle a guy when he feels that confident in what he's going to be seeing.
I think it's also why we see so many successful southpaw counterpunchers, simply because you have more space and more time to see everything coming.
Yeah.
Because, if we're talking about Tom Breese's game in general here, right? Like, Tom Breese has never shown himself to be like a devastating counterpuncher. He's still a developing striker.
He was very inexperienced as a striker.
Yeah, but he was still able to counter Cathal Pendred easily, like easy as pie in that fight repeatedly. Why? Because if that had been a closed stance matchup, if Pendred had been a southpaw, even with the gap in speed and athleticism between the two fighters, I still don't think he would have been comfortable countering Cathal Pendred in that situation. But when you give him all that distance, in addition, all that time and all that space to see the shots coming, I mean, it was no wonder that Pendred ate counter left after counter left.
Yeah, and also Pendred kept walking into that front kick because of his movement too. Because the other things orthodox fighters are told is to get your lead foot outside the lead foot of the opponent. You're supposed to step outside, to the direction of their pinky toe. You're supposed to try and move away from their rear hand, and in the process line up your rear hand, because that's the weapon you're supposed to throw, which is why I said before, these two things go hand in hand with one another. Pendred only felt like he was allowed to move to his left and to Breese's right, away from Breese's straight left, away from Breese's kick. The irony there is that by creating that little extra distance between his body and Breese's left leg, he continually opened his ribs for the front kick that ultimately ended the fight. Front kick right to the liver.
Yeah, because as he went more square, his arm came up. He got just a half a step closer, and there he was, just open for that. Yeah. Just open for that shot. But the reason that you want to get your foot outside, let's go back to basics just a little bit, is because it shortens the distance. It shortens the distance for your rear power shot.
Yeah,
that's what you want. It makes it easier to land that in a space where you normally have that much more distance to cover to land the rear hand. It shortens the path for it.
Yeah, and it's ostensibly a safer angle from which to throw it as well, because it in one sense it lengthens the distance between your head and the opponent's rear hand at the same time. Although in reality, and we will talk about this further into the episode, the southpaw can do a very small pivot and take an inside angle and have a beautiful opportunity to counter you with his left hand. And that's one of those things that always seems to befuddle the right-handed fighter, is that you'll go outside their damn foot all day long, and they just keep hitting you with the left hand. In fact, they almost seem to be letting you step outside their lead foot. They don't seem to have a problem with it at all, which begs the question, why are they not trying to do the same thing as you constantly if it's so important? It's just one of those interesting conundrums you see. And I hope we don't come across like we're saying that any of these fighters or trainers are stupid. It's a scary thing to fight a southpaw. Having gone into the gym, I can say that there's a kind of a mythos built up around it from experience, because I have sparred opponents and seen them switch southpaw. And even though my thought process is, okay, don't change anything you have to do, suddenly I'm thinking about not changing what I'm doing. And it's like walking on camera and trying to remember how you swing your arms when you walk. You can't do it when you're thinking about it. Things do change. The distance is different. You have to practice a lot to feel like your normal self against an opponent who looks and moves and attacks differently. It's a challenge. And in a lot of cases, the kind of shorthand preparation, the get your foot outside his, throw the lead right, that has worked a lot. It's a reliable, and it's a good trick to know, even if you are doing the same thing. It's nice to know those little maneuvers that are consistently effective against lefties. It's just, it's a more complex puzzle than that. As with many things in fighting, we've said this about phrases like hands up, for example. It's just more complicated than that. And so in the next segment, we can talk about some more of these matchups, specifically Darren Till versus Nicholas Dalby, Terence Crawford versus Thierry Jean, Cathal Pendred versus Tom Breese, and we will talk about other tactics that are useful against southpaws, particularly ones that aren't necessarily celebrated, and specifically, we're going to be talking about jabbing versus southpaws, which is a really kind of controversial topic in the world of combat sports. So we will get into that after this break. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials. But if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us, and like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. Okay, Pat. So, jabbing versus southpaws. That's what we want to talk about next. We saw a notable paucity of jabs in the UFC card last weekend and in MMA in general. And we saw an abundance of jabs, on the other hand, during that Terence Crawford versus Darren fight. Why don't we talk for a moment about the difficulties of jabbing a southpaw? Because there are very real difficulties associated with it. The people who say that the jab becomes ineffective aren't necessarily lying. I think they're just often overstating the true reality that jabs are different in a southpaw orthodox matchup. It can be a little trickier to land, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, so for a couple of reasons. I think because of the difference in distance that we talked about, but also going lead hand to lead hand, having your lead hands right next to each other, it makes it a lot easier to hand trap and catch and parry a jab.
Even by accident, you might just run into their shoulder and their arm.
Yeah, it's just a lot harder to get the clean angle at it. It's hard to take that nice protected big step into your opponent's power. Like you're not taking a big protected step into your opponent's power hand by moving and leaping into a jab the way that you can against in a closed guard kind of matchup. It's just a lot harder to do. And so, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try it or that there's no room for it or that it has no place. Again, as we're talking, I'm watching Rory McDonald versus Robbie Lawler, and there's tons of jabbing from both guys in that fight. In the best open guard matchup I think we've seen in MMA in a very, very long time.
A fight that I would encourage fans at home to check out would be Benny Leonard versus Lou Tendler. Benny Leonard, all-time great boxer. He fought a southpaw Lou Tendler in a time, 1922, when southpaws were barely a thing. It was not a widely known thing at this time for fighters to stand right hand forward. Almost everyone, even left-handed fighters, were taught to stand in orthodox stance. And so Benny Leonard had absolutely no experience fighting lefties, or fighting southpaws rather, and he just kind of did his normal thing. Also, Benny Leonard's got my favorite nickname, I think, in boxing history. The Ghetto Wizard is an incredible nickname. I love that nickname.
That is outstanding.
For a tough Jew from the Bronx, I mean, that's a great nickname, the Ghetto Wizard.
Well, and it's kind of funny that when you don't know another way to do it, when you don't have generations of received wisdom about how to fight a southpaw, you don't really fight them any differently.
Absolutely, now, that's exactly my point.
Yeah, I mean, not to undersell the skill and talent of Benny Leonard, but at the same time, like if you just don't have another idea in your head of how that's supposed to look or what you're supposed to do there, certainly you end up doing mostly what you would do in a normal circumstance, and it looks pretty good. And
Benny Leonard's greatest weapons were his footwork and his jab, and he did those things a lot. He moved well, he took angles well, he jabbed well. I think if you watch this fight, and as long as I don't forget, we'll attach it in the show notes, because it is definitely one worth checking out. If you watch it, one of the things that stands out, and I think this is true still today, is that in an open stance matchup, I think footwork becomes a little more important in landing the jab. Or at least a different kind of footwork. Because typically to land a jab against an orthodox opponent, you at least have to move forward. And if you are smart, you will also move to the side as you throw. But you can land your jab typically just by stepping forward. You can at least get somewhere close to target. Mixing up head to body, hit into the chest. You can at least land it in their glove right in front of their face and make them react or force them to slip just by moving straight into them. And that's because your foot naturally lines up between their feet. Your left foot, that is. So if you step forward with your left foot straight forward, you have nothing impeding the motion of your foot in closing the distance. It's really easy. And not only in open stance, not only is the lead hand of the opponent in the way, but their lead foot is in the way. And so you do have to kind of move around that sometimes to close the distance, particularly if you are at a reach disadvantage. You're going to have to use some angular footwork to make your jab effective, whereas often the jab is what makes your footwork effective. There's a little bit of a reversal there of thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I actually think, and I think the evidence would bear this out, that it's actually easier to land your jab in an open guard matchup from the inside angle, rather than doing what you're taught to do in terms of circling to the outside to line up your power hand. If you want to land your lead hand, it's actually much easier to do so from that inside angle.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's easier to land your lead hand hook from that angle too than it is to land it from outside.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you. And we'll talk about the hook too, because the hook, my opinion, the most dangerous weapon in an open stance fight, not the rear hand. And there's a lot of value in discussing that and why that is. I recently scouted where's Victor Halmy from? Oh my God, I'm blanking now. I recently scouted an opponent for a friend of mine. He's actually donated to the show before too. A Croatian fighter by the name of Ivica Trušček, who is like the guy that every promotion needs. You know, he will fight on no notice, anybody, anywhere from lightweight to welterweight. You call me and I will show up. He's got one of those crazy journeyman records, Ivica. I think he's a 30-24 by last count. Doesn't always win, but always gives a tough fight, and he has a lot of them. And he got in touch with me to scout Victor Halmy, this opponent, because Halmy is a southpaw, and Ivica relies on his jab a lot. And so in scouting Halmy, I thought a lot about jabbing southpaws, because Ivica really wanted to know, how do I get my left hand to work against a southpaw, because that's my go-to weapon. And while combination punching is really important when you have to work as hard as you do to close the distance against a southpaw, you do have to bring the right hand in. One of the, it was very comforting for me to be able to say to him, for me as well as for him, because I didn't have to work that hard to say this, don't worry, your jab is going to be really effective if you're confident in using it. Because the jab does not become a less effective weapon against a southpaw. And I agree with you, Pat. One of the first things I said was to get the lead foot inside the opponent's foot. You have to be able to break away from the traditional wisdom of always moving outside their lead foot, and you just have to be confident stepping straight forward inside their foot sometimes. The beauty of that is that a southpaw opponent very often doesn't expect you to do that, and there will be no resistance. You know, you can get your foot there without them out-positioning you. You can step in and land your jab quickly, one clean, smooth motion. And then the beauty of that is that once you start to be effective with that jab, they will start fighting your entry to that inside angle, and you can start stepping outside as much as you want and do what your coaches have been telling you to do and land your right hand.
Yeah, so I think it's helpful if we talk about that inside angle just a little bit more, because just letting your opponent take the outside angle sometimes, if they're going to fight real hard for that outside angle, if they've got it drilled into their heads that they're going to take it, sometimes you can just let them take it, pivot on your lead foot, so that you're perpendicular to them, and you can fire that rear hand power punch. That's Conor McGregor is a master of that shot, of that inside angle turn and throw. That's how he turned the tide against Dennis Seaver early in that fight. That's really when he started to dominate. As he landed Seaver, he backed Seaver up to the fence. Seaver overcommitted to the outside angle, and McGregor just pivoted and landed a straight left hand directly across the plane of Seaver's body. It's an incredibly powerful punch, because it's coming directly across the plane of your balance. You have no ability to absorb that shot with your feet. With your feet parallel like that, perpendicular to the force of the shot coming.
And it very often happens right when the opponent has convinced himself he's safe. You know, I was just moving away from his left hand. How did he hit me with it? It's a real mind bender for an opponent who's relying on that conventional wisdom. I do have a bit of technical advice, actually. This is something that has helped me. For anybody at home who trains, who's looking to fight a southpaw, or if you're a southpaw and you're fighting an orthodox fighter, for me, pivoting, is it always easier for you, Pat, to pivot to your left?
Yes.
I think that's the natural motion for everyone, right? It's easier for everyone. And for southpaws, I imagine it comes more naturally to pivot to their right, where you're basically turning out your right heel, and then you step around with your rear foot. Like for me, it's two steps. That's my easiest way of thinking of it. I turn to pivot to my left. So if I'm an orthodox fighter, I'm going clockwise I will pivot my left foot, and then all I do is step with my right foot, and suddenly I'm at a new angle. I step behind myself and around to line my rear foot back up with the new angle my lead foot has taken. A really good piece of advice given to me by my mentor, Luis Monda, on pivoting the other direction is not to worry about pivoting on the lead foot so much as getting the rear foot in position. You want to, just as when you're stepping side to side, you want to move the foot in the direction, you want to move the foot closer to the direction in which you want to move first. And so because you're pivoting to your right, you want to move your rear foot first, and the trick is to turn your rear foot before stepping. So if you kind of pivot your right foot on the ground as if throwing a cross, and then just take a short step forward and to your right, then you adjust your left foot. It's a much easier way of pivoting. It's almost just like taking a natural step with a small adjustment. It's a lot easier than, because I find it really difficult to spin towards my right on the ball of my left foot. It's a really awkward motion for me.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And like, I find that I do that a lot if I'm trying to cover distances I throw anyway. Instead of pivoting on the ball of your foot, just opening your hips as you move, as you take the step.
Yeah, it's almost like a shift, right? It's like a shift, except you're taking an angle while you step forward. You're not just trying to cover distance.
Or what they would call in Dutch style an adjustment step.
Sure. Yeah.
Where it's not a full shift step, but you're just covering distances you throw. You're coming to almost parallel either direction as you move your feet.
Yeah, and this angle makes for a beautiful counter angle, as Pat was saying, in an open stance engagement, because the other guy, if he's fighting really hard to get his foot outside yours, first of all, you can throw that jab down the center. You can just stick your left hand out if it's a southpaw against you, or if you're a southpaw, you can stick your right hand out as the orthodox opponent steps in, and they will half the time just run into it. It's difficult, because by moving away from what they fear, the line of your rear hand, they are moving in line with your jab. And that's the thing that's not normally lined up in this matchup, so a lot of fighters don't think to use it. But I've had a lot of success against guys who stand lefty, just kind of, just letting them run into it. It doesn't take too much effort when they fight that hard to get outside your foot.
With the hook from that angle, too, it often seems, and I'm not sure exactly why this is. Do you think it has to do with maybe the position of the shoulder, Connor? That it seems like it's a blind angle if you want to land a hook from the inside.
I think that has everything to do with
angle.
it. Yeah, I think that has everything to do with it. And if you watch that Benny Leonard-Lou Tendler fight, the great Benna, the Ghetto Wizard, did not have a lot of trouble with Tendler's left hand, not in particular, throughout most of the early going in the fight, because he seemed to easily see it coming because it was so far away, and being a confident boxer type, he just stepped back and pivoted and moved away from it. The punch that kept catching him early was Tendler's right hook, because no matter how good you are as a boxer, if you stand in a good defensive position with your lead shoulder higher than your right shoulder, covering some of your chin with your left hand up and slightly extended to kind of create this defensive threatening appearance, those things block your view of the lead side of your own body. Everything beneath your shoulder, beneath your left glove, that's difficult to see. And most good hooks that I have seen tend to come up and over. If you watch Mike Tyson throw a hook, if you watch Joe Louis, beautiful left hooks, he throws them with his elbow down, they start low, and then his elbow comes up, and as he follows through, it's almost like a very slight rainbow, like a parabolic curve to the arc of the fist. And that makes it really, really ideal for going over a shoulder in this open stance matchup. And so it's really tricky because you don't see that hook until it's just peeked up over your shoulder, and at that point it's usually already smashing into your chin.
Yeah, and that's why Robbie Lawler's right hook has historically been so succawful, I think, against orthodox fighters is because it comes from that blind angle.
Yeah.
Because of the kind of weird arc that he throws it at. It's not like Lawler does not throw an incredibly tight right hook.
No.
And that makes it even more devastating. It's not just that he gets a lot of power behind it, it's that it's very difficult to see coming.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a wide looping shot. It's a upside down U kind of shape to it. It's like a steering wheel motion almost, the way he throws it.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and what's another fight that had a great... if you want to see a left hook being used against a southpaw, Miguel Cotto versus Sergio Martinez.
Oh, God, that was beautiful. He knocked him down with that punch like 3 times.
3 times in the first round. Everybody will tell you that Sergio Martinez's knee was gone because his knee was hurt and everything. Absolutely, he was not in tip-top condition but the left hook did the damage. And if his knee ended up being busted at some point in the fight, it was almost certainly the left hook that did it, because that was a clinic on Miguel Cotto, who is actually a left-handed orthodox fighter and therefore has a very naturally powerful jab and left hook, using those weapons to great effect against a southpaw. And you could see how much difficulty Sergio Martinez had, and Martinez is a good defensive fighter. You could see how much difficulty he had just seeing that punch coming. The first 3, 4, 5 times it caught him, 3 of those knocking him down with that exact same punch, he was blind to it. It just caught him completely off guard, and it put him on the canvas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so what else do we have? What else do we have against southpaws? The jab. Why else is the jab important? This is something I want to get into, because we mentioned earlier, we kind of touched on the fact that abandoning the jab, it makes it very difficult for an orthodox fighter to prepare for a southpaw opponent, right? Because they've been told their whole career, you go 1-2 when you're shadowboxing. The jab goes before the right hand. That doesn't stop being true against southpaws. That's the other half of that point, right? Not only is it more awkward to throw the right hand as a lead because you're probably not used to it unless you've practiced it a lot, but the jab is still a really good lead. The 1-2 is still very effective. Pat, you were saying during the break how many good 1-2s you noticed in that Rory McDonald, Robbie Lawler fight.
Yeah, I mean, why? Because your jab, you're so used to using it to tell you where your opponent is. You're so used to using it to set the distance, and that, to me, if we want to engage in a kind of an awkward segue here, was what stood out to me so much about the Terence Crawford Jerry John fight.
Yeah,
right. And it's what stood out about Lawler McDonald too, is both guys were very aware of where their opponent was, and that's how they threw as much volume as they did. Right, because they were constantly measuring with their lead hand, and they were throwing their lead hand.
Yeah, particularly Crawford, who's not afraid. He looks like Tommy Hearns, and he's not afraid to use that Tommy Hearns pawing jab, where half the time he's really just posting his arm on his opponent's face and keeping them in place while he winds up on his cross.
Exactly. Well, Jerry John had no idea what he was supposed to do at that point.
No.
He had no idea how to deal with Crawford's southpaw jab, whereas Lawler and McDonald both threw it back at each other, and that's how both were able to put a consistent volume of strikes out there. They were both aware of that. But when only one guy does that, when one guy sets the distance and dominates the range, when one guy gets to pick and choose what the spacing is going to be, like, the jab still serves that purpose in an orthodox southpaw matchup. It's just we don't see it used for that all that often.
Yeah, and it's a blinder, right? The jab is always a blinder, and so again, we get to this topic of footwork. Footwork is always the one that comes up, the topic that comes up first when you talk about orthodox southpaw matchups, and for good reason. Though, as we've mentioned several times, it may be a bit overanalyzed in some respects. But the thing is footwork is easy to see if you're not subtle about it, especially if you're going for the same thing over and over. And so if a southpaw opponent sees you constantly trying to move outside their lead foot, they're going to detect that movement over and over and over again. And you're not doing anything to disguise it, because you are telling yourself, I can't jab, I have to get to this angle before I can punch. And so it becomes relatively easy to stop that from happening. If I'm using my jab as a southpaw, or if I'm using an inside angle, I can thwart you without too much trouble if you're just trying to take the same angle over and over. So not only do you make yourself more capable by switching up the angles, by attacking both, capitalizing on one to open the other, but you can disguise which direction you are moving by using your jab. If you keep your lead hand, which opposite to the rear hand is the closest weapon to that far target, the opponent's head, and so much easier to land from a distance perspective, or at least much easier to get in their face. If you keep that out there, then you can kind of make all the moves you want. If you're confident in blinding the other guy, you have a lot more freedom of navigating the ring and navigating your opponent.
Yeah, I mean, really good example of that. The battle between George St. Pierre's jab and Johnny Hendricks' right hook when they fought.
Yeah.
And George St. Pierre used his jab every possible way you could use a jab against a southpaw in that fight. I mean, he used it when he found himself on the inside angle. He used it to keep himself safe. He used it to keep his chin hidden. He used it to set up his steps to the outside, to get that dominant rear angle. The jab is what gave George St. Pierre three rounds on that on the judges' scorecards in that fight. It's what won him the fight, whether you think that he won that fight or not. Was his willingness and ability to continue using the jab despite despite all the factors that make that difficult or make it unusual to see that in a Southpaw Orthodox matchup.
Yeah. I mean, something being slightly more difficult than usual does not make it invaluable. Invaluable is not the right word because that means extremely valuable. Does not make it non-valuable. It doesn't take away its value. In fact, that's often what makes it more rewarding, right? Because the opponent feels confident that you can't exploit that, and so when you do, they're not going to react as well as they might otherwise. So it's valuable to look at Southpaw opponents as something that has to be planned for. I think we both agree there. But I think it's really worth trying to make yourself as natural as possible against a lefty. Because the more you take yourself out of your comfort zone, the more you feel pressured to change your shot selection, to change the way that you move, you're going to be in a very different boat from the guy across from you who has faced many, many opponents who have been trying to do the same uncomfortable things you are going to be trying to do that night. So I think that wraps up our Southpaw discussion. We're going to have one more break, and when we come back, we are going to try and get to the heavy bag. We have a little bit of a backlog of heavy bag questions, in fact, and so we're going to answer a few, and then that'll be it for us. So one more break. Here we go. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. And we are back. As promised, we are going to go to the heavy bag. And our first question comes to us by way of friend of the show, sometimes nemesis of the show, Bloody Elbow Rider Mookie Alexander. And Mookie asks, how would you handicap Crawford versus Pacquiao? I think I might break Crawford's leg.
Yeah.
What do you think? What's your...
Yeah, you want to go all Tanya Harding with it.
Yeah. I think the ice skater method really works. So I think that's what I'd probably do. How about you, Pat?
I'm there. I'm with you.
Okay, moving on. Next question. What do you see, Pat? I mean, how do you see that fight as a matchup? Handicapping in an odds perspective. Let's each give a line on how we see that fight.
I mean, so I would see Crawford as a small favorite.
Okay.
I think I would have Crawford minus 200 maybe as my line. I think that which may be surprising to people. But what's your thought, Connor?
My expectation on what the line will be. What I expect the handicap to look like is probably something along the lines of plus 300 Pacquiao, which is actually a very narrow line for Pacquiao fights. Mm-hmm. My line is probably a very slim favorite for Crawford. Maybe like minus 150 range to Pacquiao at, something similar as an underdog. If not like plus 105, something like that. I really think it's a close matchup, but we both agree that we think Crawford probably has the edge at this point in both men's respective careers. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Crawford's sheer adaptability is a thing of marvel, is a thing to marvel at. His ability to switch things up mid-fight, his sense not just to know that what his different options are, but his sense for when to do them, I think is really, really, really sharp. And he's mean too.
He's very mean. He's a dick.
Yeah, that's not like I mean, I don't say that as a commentary on the man's personal life, but he is a mean fighter. He's got great killer instinct. He's got a really great sense for when you're hurt. He's got a great sense for what is giving you problems, for reading his opponent in the ring. Those are rare skills to have. And not even the most technically skilled guys don't necessarily have those kinds of innate and developed senses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should underline the fact that it's not a commentary on Crawford's character. As far as I can tell, he seems to be a great guy in person. He has been responsible for lowering ticket prices in Omaha so that his hometown crowd can come and have him, come and see him fight, single-handedly reviving a pretty much non-existent Omaha boxing scene in the process. He is, by all accounts, a loving and devoted family man. His crazy loud family is always in the front row at his fights. Seems like a nice guy. But from a boxing perspective, I think that meanness really stands out. In fact, there was a great moment after this fight with Thierry Jean where Max Kellerman comes up to him and it's kind of an awkward thing to ask. So Max Kellerman understandably awkwardly said, you seem mean. Why do you seem so mean in the fight? Why did you seem particularly pissed off tonight? And Crawford, his eyes were still on Thierry Jean, who he had just stopped in the 10th round of this fight. He just knocked him out, forced the referee to save him after beating him pretty badly for the prior 10 rounds, going back to the very first round in which he knocked him down. And his eyes on Thierry Jean, he said, well, if you look at these two men over to your left, they were talking all kind of smack to me before the fight. And then you get the sense, it's just on his face, the camera, but you get the sense that Jean and his trainers look over at Crawford as he's talking, and he raises his eyebrows and said, "Did you get what you was looking for?" Yeah, and just smiles at him. Like he's got a cruel streak, which I think you need to be an elite fighter. You got to be okay with hurting an opponent. And that combined with his adaptability, his versatility, his ring intelligence, makes him really dangerous, because not only will he figure out how to hurt you, he will have a gusto to do it.
Yeah, because when you look at Crawford as a collection of physical characteristics, he's not terribly imposing. He's not terribly big.
No.
He's not terribly powerful.
He's pretty long, but he's not fast. He's pretty long for his division.
Yeah, but he's not enormous. He's not like Victor Postal or something where he's like comically large, or like Paul Williams or somebody like that. It's not like he has these overwhelming physical characteristics relative to his competition. I mean, he's got fast hands, but he's not exceptionally fast-handed. He's a good athlete. He's not a great athlete. He's got plus power, but he doesn't have enormous power. But when you put all that together with his intelligence and his craft, and he knows how to do a lot of different things. He's versatile. He's adaptable. We've talked about that. He can counter beautifully. He can lead. He can fight in the pocket. He can pressure. He can fight off the back foot. Like, he can do all of those things.
And he takes a great punch, too.
Yeah, oh yeah. He's perfectly willing to bang it out with you in the pocket if necessary. But when you put all those different things together, the whole is worth so much more than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what makes Crawford so good.
And then on the Pacquiao side, I think we both kind of agree that Manny has slipped somewhat. I think we even saw that going into the Mayweather fight. The Mayweather fight, again, to me, I didn't think it was a bad fight. I'm really sick of talking about it. And I was immediately exhausted once the fight was done because it was such a hectic month of coverage leading up to that bout. But I thought it was a pretty good fight. I'm not sure what we all expected from a Mayweather fight. I guess we expected that Pacquiao would be so different from his previous opponents that he would make him not fight a Mayweather fight. So to me, it really underscored the brilliance of Floyd Mayweather as a boxer and as an intelligent craftsman in this sport. But it also kind of showed where Manny Pacquiao has begun to slip, where he doesn't have the same athletic ability to so creatively exploit angles, because Manny Pacquiao is in a lot of ways like a Roy Jones, where he's put himself in the right positions, right? But he doesn't always get there the right way. He doesn't get there the textbook way. And so he's going to take the right angles. But like that inside angle we talked about before in the episode, the one that's so often a valuable weapon in the Southpaws arsenal, Manny has used that throughout his career. But if you watch his earlier fights, he almost always flings his rear foot off the ground and spins completely balanced on his lead foot as he throws his punch while taking the angle, completely off balancing himself. That's not right. He's exploiting the right openings, but not doing it correctly. And as his ability to get away with those things has faded, he has lost a little of what made him so special. And that's understandable, being a 36-year-old, I believe he is.
Yeah, and there's nothing surprising about that. Like, this isn't a uniquely Manny Pacquiao kind of problem, And it's not like we're shitting on Manny Pacquiao for Father Time having taken its toll. Like, this is what happens as fighters get older. Some guys age better than others, but Manny Pacquiao's game has never been the kind that had a lot of margin for error in this kind of physical decline. You know, for a guy who relied so heavily on that, it's not that he doesn't have craft, but it's that his craft was always heavily rooted in his physicality and his ability to get to those special things.
Yes, and Crawford is versatile and confident, on a roll right now, dangerous both mentally and physically, and 8 years Pacquiao's junior. So I think that pretty much sums up why we both favor Crawford, if only slightly on my side. And I think yours is relatively slight too. Mine is 200, certainly not a wipeout. Yeah. So that's the way it is. Our next question, what were we going to look at?
This is a question from a couple of weeks ago. We promised we'd get to it. It comes to us from Keith Farrell, at Keith, Farrell on Twitter. And his question is there a certain discipline to the high-level strikers from the Caucasus region? So guys like Albert Tumanov, Rashid and Ruslan Magomedov, Adlan Amagov, because, to quote Keith here, it looks very different from stereotypical combat sambo striking. And he's asking, what are the roots of this style? And a lot of it comes from Russian-style boxing. You see that the kind of Eastern Bloc boxing techniques that we see. Guys like Tumanov and Magomedov are both masters of sports in boxing in Russia.
And I believe also, if you look at their guys who have a master of sport in hand-to-hand combat, I believe that is basically like military boxing.
Yes, it has a lot to do. It has a lot to do with that. But specifically, I think that Keith is asking more about their kicks, because they do kick much differently than we see from more Thai-style strikers. That's changing a bit, because a lot of dudes from that region are going to Thailand, and they're spending a lot of time, especially at Tiger Muay Thai and Phuket Top Team. But traditionally, no, they've had a distinct style of kicking that comes very heavily out of karate as it was practiced in Russia in general, and the North Caucasus in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and why do you think that is? To me, I think there's a lot of I think there's a heavy interest in gi sports in general in that region. Obviously, judo being very popular in Eastern Europe, and judo having such a huge influence on sambo and combat sambo. From the same perspective, I think that back when the sort of Russian military, the Soviet military hand-to-hand combat curriculum was being devised, they drew influence from the Japanese striking arts as well. And so I think there's still a lot of popularity behind things like Kyokushin karate, other karate styles which are competed with under knockdown rules, where head punches might be restricted, but they are full contact, leg kicks, all of the body except the head being open, and the head being open to kicks and knees as well, which doesn't really make sense to me if you're going to not allow people to punch, but you're going to allow them to get kneed in the mouth. And then Kudo as well, I think has some significant popularity. And
Kudo, and also things like kick jitsu is another particular rule set. Yeah. But there are a lot of competition rule sets that involve kicks that are rooted more in karate than they are in Thai style striking.
Yeah.
So what you get is a weird blend of karate and very, very technical, very offensively oriented boxing that comes out of this region. But so that's why their kicks are snappy. It's why you see a lot of high kicks, not a ton of leg kicks, a lot of body and high kicks, because again, a lot of karate influence there. But the technique is different. You see that really clearly, especially with like Ruslan Magomedov. Ruslan Magomedov is an almost exclusively karate style kicker.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Especially with the kicks off the lead leg, the Brazilian kicks. He's a very dynamic. He fights like who's the Brazilian kickboxer who had the amazing Brazil kick?
Glaba Feitosa.
That's what I'm thinking of. I was going to say Gleason.
Francisco Filho.
Yeah, but I'm really thinking of Feitosa. He was the Brazilian kick guy for me. Filho, actually, from a Kyokushin background, Filho was really known for his sidekick in Kyokushin. He had a great sidekick. For some reason, it never made the transition to his K1 career. He was never a sidekicker in K1. He was a low kicker more than anything.
Yep.
Very strange. And an awkward but powerful boxer. But yeah, and then you also look at the kicking game of guys like Rashid Magomedov. Magomedov being more of a boxer, but he also has a very dynamic lead leg kicking game. He kicks with the instep rather than the shin with most of his attacks. He emphasizes height chamber and quickness, snap and unpredictability over loading up and throwing heavy power. And that's really, I think that style of kicking kind of blends better with boxing too for a lot of guys, for the light-footed outfighter or counterfighter. If you look at classic kickboxing before international rules kickboxing became a thing. If you look at the days when guys used to kickbox in hilarious glitter-covered gi pants, guys like Superfoot, Bill Wallace, and Steve, who am I thinking of? Steve Superkick Vic. Super, a lot of nicknames involving Super. Mm-hmm. These guys were like Taekwondo or karate-style kickers who added boxing to their game. And it really worked. The boxing really went well with this sort of light-footed, movement-heavy, less emphasis on power, more emphasis on speed. It really blended well. Whereas I think a lot of guys who learned a traditional kind of stay light on your feet and move and take angles school of boxing would struggle to adapt to Muay Thai, which is today taught in a very static way. They don't really blend together quite so well. Would you agree?
Yeah, well, and I think that it's worth noting, too, as we have this discussion, that Dutch-style kickboxing is rooted in Kyokushin and not necessarily in Muay Thai. Like, there is Muay Thai added to it, but Dutch-style kickboxing is basically a blend of karate and boxing to start with as well.
Although it's worth saying that Kyokushin derives a lot from Muay Thai.
It does, yeah. This is like when we talk about these like disciplinary boundaries in the martial arts, just like the rest of the world, are not hard and firm things. These are labels that we apply, but there's always cross-pollination, fertilization, and they don't these are not separate categories that we can just hang on things that have explanatory value on their own.
Yeah, and since we're discussing the heavy bag, we often get a lot of questions that are like, "Oh, what's the next style to arrive in MMA?" And that's not a dumb question. We've seen a lot of guys who have really sort of introduced a style to MMA. Lyoto Machida with karate, obviously. But I hesitate to look at things like that, especially as the sport continues to grow. I'm really more interested in looking at just kind of applicability across the board of certain techniques, of certain strategies. I'm not sure that we're going to see that many revolutions of new styles coming into MMA in the future. I don't think right now we're seeing like Sambo coming into MMA so much as we are seeing Sambists coming into MMA and guys who have the benefit of a background in Sambo, but who are not like proving the dominance of Sambo as an art form.
I agree with that. I think we're going to see more individual techniques kind of pop back to usefulness. Like Luke Thomas had a great article on MMA fighting this week about the sudden resurgence of the guillotine.
Yeah, he interviewed Faraz Zahabi for that.
Yeah, and Faraz mentioned in that when Luke was talking to him in that article that he thinks the Kimura is going to make a big comeback, and I think he's right. I think that, and we've seen it a little bit. The guys using a double wrist lock, like when they get rear waist cinched, to using a double wrist lock to escape. I think we'll see more Kimuras from the top side. I think he's right about that. But I think a big one that we'll see is the side kick. I think we're going to see a lot more side kicks.
I think that one's already starting to flourish, thanks to John Jones, probably.
Yeah, they're useful techniques, and it's a matter of the rest of your game being built such that you can use those techniques in an effective way without exposing yourself to undue risk and danger.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Okay, well, thank you, Keith. Thank you, Mookie, for your question. Sorry it took so long to get to your question, Keith, but we thought it was worth answering. That's why we held on to it this long. And that about does it for today's episode. Pat, do you have anything you want to tell the peeps at home about before we wrap up?
Yeah, I have a reported article that I did coming out about Robbie Lawler and Carlos Condit, which is partially why I had Robbie Lawler on the brain so much during today's episode. But I went to a media lunch and I heard them talk, and they both said interesting things, and so I've built an article around that. That will be out on Bleacher Report probably the day this episode goes up on Wednesday.
Lovely, lovely. As for me, I've got some Terence Crawford breakdown coming out later this week. Can't avoid talking about that one. You can also find work from me now going forward for the foreseeable future on Flow Sports' new boxing platform, which is flowboxing.tv. I recently wrote an article about Roman Gonzalez, one of my favorite boxers to watch, who we discussed on the show last week or the week before last. It was last week, right?
I think both.
Yeah, I think about them on both. I think you're right. So we talked about him extensively. So if you want to watch him in action, you want to see some highlights, some little technical details, you can check that out. Again, that's flowboxing.tv. And the Path to the Podium, the Olympic third stage of the Olympic qualifiers, is also going on this week, and they are doing live coverage of that. And I'll probably be doing some results or analysis of basically the big amateur hopefuls for the American boxing team for the next Olympics. So that should be interesting too. I haven't done a lot of amateur boxing coverage. I'm excited to kind of delve into that world.
That's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially now that amateur boxing has come around and is now being scored using the 10-9, the 10-point must system, and they don't use headgear anymore either. So it's basically short professional boxing. Easy to dip my toes in that water. It's very familiar. So looking forward to that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed today's episodes. It's always fun to talk about footwork and sort of misconceptions of strategic preparation. It's always fun to talk about Southpaws because of those reasons. And if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, particularly face jabbing, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.